Well, in our series through the various sermons from the major prophets, we're now in Daniel, and as I've mentioned before, I am going to attempt to do the whole of Daniel because it's so much shorter than the other three. But in Daniel chapter 3, there's absolutely no mention of him at all. Instead, this chapter is all about his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The account of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is probably one of the best known accounts in the Bible, although perhaps not so much these days. And, actually, the speed with which such widespread ignorance of the Bible has spread, it really should remind us that any church is just one generation away from disappearing. Without new blood, the lights will go out, both spiritually and actually. But that is not what we're considering today. We're going to look at the first half of this third chapter of Daniel, that is verses 1 to 18 that we just read together. We could title those 18 verses, The Pride of the World Against the Trust of the Church. And we can actually do that under three subheadings that come from various other verses in the Bible. The first of those is found in 2 Peter 2 and verse 22, which says, "The sow that was washed has returned to her wallowing in the mire." The second is from John 16 verse 33, which says, "In the world ye shall have tribulation." And then the third is from Matthew 13 and verse 13, "He that shall endure unto the end, the same shall be saved." So those are the three subheadings, if you like, in these 18 verses. But we'll start then with the first. The sow that was washed has returned to her wallowing in the mire. And this really covers the first 7 verses of Daniel 3. Now I say this because if you'll recall, last week when we were dealing with the second half of chapter 2, we read in verse 47, we read King Nebuchadnezzar there saying to Daniel, "Of a truth it is that your God is a God of gods and a Lord of kings." Now I said at the time that Nebuchadnezzar exercised a kind of faith when he believed what Daniel told him. But as I said, I don't think from that we can draw from that statement that Nebuchadnezzar was as yet converted. And these events here in chapter 3 really highlight that point. We see previously in that second chapter, Nebuchadnezzar, he's been brought close, but he's not crossed the line, if I can put it like that. And without saving faith, the kind of faith that clings to the living God and despairs of self, without that kind of faith, eventually the unconverted heart will revert to form, no matter how good the intentions seem to be at the beginning. We can think of our lives, think of your life, like an elastic band. When it's laying still, let's say it's got a diameter of 2 inches, say. Well, you know that you can stretch it beyond the 2 inches to various other diameters. It's only when you let go, it reverts then back to its original 2-inch diameter. But then if you stretch it too far and it breaks, and it is only when the elastic band breaks that it will not return to its 2-inch diameter. And if we are to be a truly changed people, we need to be broken. As it says in Psalm 34 and verse 18, "The Lord is nigh unto them that are of a broken heart, and saveth such as be of a contrite spirit." Now, I'm not saying that people cannot change their behaviour. I'm sure many people do. I'm sure of that. But to be changed into the kind of people that God requires us to be, there needs to be this brokenness. There needs to be a giving up of ourselves and our own perceived worth and glory. And so we see that Nebuchadnezzar, we see him not doing that very thing. We see him returning to form. At some point, we're not quite sure how long these events were after the events of chapter 2, but at some point he decides he's going to build this massive idol. And it is extremely large, 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide. Now to you and me, that's 90 feet tall by 9 feet wide. This was quite evidently something that was meant to be seen. Now, some have suggested that this cannot be right, this size. The thing would have been hideous to look upon. Well, let's not forget, this was not a statue of Nebuchadnezzar himself. It was an idol. That is, it was a supposed god. And if you have any doubt about that, you just got to look at verse 14. There the king is interviewing Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and he says to them, "Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, do not ye serve my gods, nor worship the golden image which I have set up?" So this monstrosity is meant to be a god. And if you look at some of the idols that have survived since that time, well, they were hideous. And to say this can't possibly be for real because it would have been hideous looking is meaningless, because lots of idols that have survived that we can see, they were all hideous. But then another objection is raised and said, well, how is it possible that this massive object should be made of gold? Well, I wouldn't be in the least bit surprised that it was made of gold, because there was in the head of Nebuchadnezzar that memory of the statue that he'd had in a dream, remember? And that statue, the head of that statue, was made of gold. Daniel had told him that this was because his kingdom was so glorious. That may then have been why and what inspired Nebuchadnezzar to build this idol in gold. But then it's fair to say, remember, it's 90 feet high by 9 feet wide. It is fair to say that's an awful lot of gold. But it needn't have been solid gold. I mean, the idol itself could have been hollow, for all we know. And, of course, it could have been covered in gold leaf. When people object to what the Bible teaches us, or tells us, they rarely, if ever, apply themselves to the actual narrative that they're complaining about. Anyway, Nebuchadnezzar, then he had this giant idol built, and Nebuchadnezzar, he would determine when it would be worshipped. And we're seeing the signal for worship was this mini symphony, by the look of the way the instruments are listed. But the point is that the idol must be worshipped at that time. Now, do you see what this says about Nebuchadnezzar? Do you know what he's saying about himself, really? Because you might wonder, well, why didn't he have a giant golden statue built of himself? Why didn't he do that? If he was filled with such self-centeredness, which he plainly was, why was this statue not of him? Well, you see what he's done in doing what he did. He was setting himself among the gods. And not just that, he was setting himself above the gods, because he decided when they would be worshipped. Now that is a common failing among mankind, that pride can lift our hearts to such ludicrous heights. Now, this reminds us of the words of Isaiah that we find in Isaiah 14 and verse 12. There it says, "How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground, which didst weaken the nations?" And then that goes on to say in the next verse, "For thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north." Now, if you read that whole passage in Isaiah, you'll see that he's speaking of the king of Babylon. And some have said that it was a prophecy about Nebuchadnezzar. Now, that is possible. But even in the time of Isaiah, the kings of Babylon, who were Assyrian, part of the Assyrian Empire at that time, even then they were troublesome. I mean, the Assyrians, after all, they'd taken the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom away into captivity. And then just as a by the way, if you think that the passage in Isaiah is speaking of Satan, well, it might be, but only indirectly. The text in Isaiah itself actually does refer to the king of Babylon. But we know that Jesus says in Luke 10:18, "I beheld Satan as lightning fall from heaven." And also the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians 11, verse 14, he said, "And no marvel, for Satan himself is transformed into an angel of light." So given those things, it is not unreasonable to conclude that the passage in Isaiah does give us an insight into the fall of Satan. But my point today is that our pride can run out of control. We can have, quite literally, stupid ideas about ourselves. This is what has happened to Nebuchadnezzar with his golden idol. And so taken up was Nebuchadnezzar with his own elevation, his own aggrandizement, that he declared the death penalty for anybody that did not obey his command. And not just the death penalty, but a really nasty death at that, cast into the fiery furnace. Now, whether those furnaces were for common use, for brick building, say, or whether they were purpose-built for this punishment, we can no longer say. But what it does show us is that the king was not of a mind to allow any excuse from his command. This was the depth to which he had sunk, even after he had confessed to Daniel and said, "Of a truth it is that your God is a God of gods and a Lord of kings." So do you see that? Good words do not produce good people. Unless and until we repent and seek God's forgiveness, we will revert to form one way or another with quite devastating effects, if not for others, then for ourselves. But then secondly, this evening, the words of Jesus, "In the world ye shall have tribulation." Now I say this because of the violence of worldly ambition that's depicted for us really in verses 8 to 12 of our passage. We've noted that the king had instigated the death penalty for lack of compliance with his command. He was not in the least interested in allowing any excuse for any of his subjects. But why did he think that such a deterrent was even necessary? The heathens over which he ruled, they all allowed for a multiplicity of gods. So why should he even suspect that there would be anyone that would refuse to worship the image that he had set up? This has led to some saying that he must have been concerned about the Jews. But we can't forget that the Jews as a whole, that the very reason that the Lord had taken them into captivity was because of their persistent falling back into idolatry. So the vast majority of them probably didn't care about worshipping idols. So unless the king was suspicious of those ones whom he had promoted, there doesn't seem to be a reason to think that he had it in for the Jews. And given his surprise at Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego when he interviews them, I can't see that there's a place to assume he suspected them either. You know, it really does look like him just closing any loophole there might be for any people. He wasn't allowing for any disobedience to his role as God maker. Now we know that Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego did not obey. And something else that we know about them is they were promoted to be over the affairs of the province of Babylon at a pretty young age. So that would have meant they were promoted over the heads of others who were probably a bit miffed about that. So when we read in verse 8, wherefore at that time certain Chaldeans came near and accused the Jews, I mean, that really then looks like revenge. Now, who these Chaldeans were, we're not sure. We've noted before that the term Chaldean not only refers to ethnicity, but appears to have been a priestly caste as well. Someone was put out, and they see this as their chance to act. These Chaldeans, whoever they were, they go on to say to the king in verse 12, there are certain Jews whom thou hast set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not regarded thee. They serve not thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. You think about this. When so many people would have obeyed the command upon hearing the music, they couldn't worship at any time. They all had to do it together when the music played. So with so many people worshipping like that, you wonder how they spotted these three in particular not obeying. Now, I don't doubt they would have stood out if you looked in the right direction. But given that everyone should have been bowing down or falling to the ground in worship, how come they could see these three men? I mean, that's hypocrisy, isn't it? Because they must not have been worshipping to have been able to see that the three men, the three boys, whatever their age was, were not worshipping. Now, I said that I doubted that Nebuchadnezzar particularly had it in for these three, but these Chaldeans certainly did. And when they see them not falling down, they scurry off to the king, and they remind the king of what he has commanded, making sure that they don't miss out the point about the punishment for non-conformity. And they go on to point the finger at these three Jews and say, these men, O king, they've not regarded thee. What they're saying, in effect, is that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego have treated you contemptuously. They don't care about you. They're really portraying these three in as dark a way as they can. And now I don't think, as I've said, I don't think we can draw from this that these three were picked on because they were Jews, because there was a whole host of other Jews who were bowing down and worshipping the idol. The whole narrative here is much more suggestive that they simply put these Chaldeans' noses out of joint, as the expression goes. And they didn't like it. In Titus 3 and verse 3, the Apostle Paul describes the natural outworking of the life of an unbeliever. He says that they are foolish, disobedient, deceived, serving diverse lusts and pleasures, living in malice and envy, hateful and hating one another. He said this is the typical behaviour of people of the world. They do not like it when things get in their way. And given that they will hate one another, hate one another, given that's how they treat each other, but how much worse will it be for people whose lifestyles are at complete variance with theirs? The reason Jesus told us that in the world ye shall have tribulation is because of that difference. He said, if the world hate you, ye know that it hated me before it hated you. And to make sure we don't miss the point, he went on to say, if ye were of the world would love his own. But because ye are not of the world, but I have chosen you out of the world, therefore the world hateth you. And because this really is the state of play, you and I, we can't expect to avoid troubles in this world. In light of this, what I would say to you is that we should not go out of our way to make it easy for them. Instead, we should seek to live such lives, such good lives, that it would be hard for such people to trouble us. But we should not be fooled. This world is a fallen world. Human beings are naturally opposed to God, and they will, if it suits them and they have the ability to do so, they will trample all over those associated with God. We can't be naive about this. Our reliance must always be on our God. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they'd been promoted to their positions by the king himself. So they might have thought that they were pretty safe from the rest of the world. But no, the world turned on them. The world, in the form of these Chaldeans, turned on them. The world will turn on us if we are perceived to be a threat to them. If we do not worship their gods, by which we can say that if we do not follow their mindset and philosophy, then we risk suffering their wrath. And they will. If they have opportunity, they will exercise that wrath upon us. In the world we shall have tribulation. But then my third point is captured by the words from Mark 13 and verse 13. These are the words of Jesus. He that shall endure unto the end, the same shall be saved. This is based on the fact that although they believe that God can deliver them, these three, from their distress, they say that even if he doesn't, they will still be obedient to him, even if it costs their lives. As we see, the king is in a rage that anybody should dare challenge his position as God maker. But he gives these three a second chance. It's not beyond the realms of possibility that he can see that these young men have been set up. But whether that is so or not, they must do as he commands. I say he's not allowing any loopholes. Nobody is allowed to refute his position as God maker. And he reiterates the punishment. He says, if you don't do this, if you worship not, ye shall be cast the same hour into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. And then he adds, and who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands? As we have often noted, rage blinds the eyes. This king, he should have remembered after his encounter with Daniel that the God of the Jews was unlike any other supposed God that he had dealt with. Well, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were not put off by such threats. And when they say we are not careful to answer thee in this matter, what that means is that they say, well, we don't need to think about this. We know what we're going to do. They know that their God is for real, that he is not some lifeless idol whose behaviour is subject to the whim of a man, which this giant idol certainly was. Their God, the God of these three young men, the God of the Bible, the God whom we worship here at the VRs, he is the one who gives life, who sustains life, but who also takes away life. And they not only know that their God can deliver them from the king's threats, they are confident that he will deliver them Now, there's no indication that they've been granted any foresight of deliverance. It is likely that they saw the king's behaviour as blasphemous, and they just couldn't imagine that he would be allowed to get away with it. But although they are confident, we can say that they were not overconfident. They add to their statement, "But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up." And do you see what they're saying there? They're saying they would rather die than disobey God. This is a practical example of what the apostles would later say when they were being threatened by the Jewish council. In Acts 5:29 we read, "Then Peter and the other apostles answered and said, we ought to obey God rather than men." That's just what these three young men did. It's a risk of their own lives. I wonder how many of us would be as bold as these three. I'm not pointing any fingers because I know three fingers point at me. But we will, if we search our hearts, we'll find that we are much more inclined to find ways around our disobedience. Well, I'm not going to do that. And then we make it right in our own mind. But these three, they know that their God, who is our God, remember, he can do what Nebuchadnezzar believes no God can do. And in times of trouble and distress, we ought always to trust in God rather than falling into sin. Whatever God's sovereign purposes for us may be, we have nothing to fear. We serve a great God. We serve a caring God. And that's what these three young men tell the king. They know too much about what the Lord has done for Israel. They know too much for them to believe that he hasn't anything but good intentions for them. So their steadfastness, their intent to remain faithful to the bitter end, gives us a picture of what a true believer is like. You know, I'm sure, that the essence of the gospel is believe on the Lord Jesus Christ and you will be saved. But as I've often pointed out, the thing about faith is that anybody can say they have it. The truth is, though, that for faith to be more than an empty word, it must persevere to the end. That is saving faith. When Jesus said those words, "He that shall endure unto the end, the same shall be saved," well, he was talking about the hardships that his followers were likely to face in this world. But notice how he doesn't say, well, it's okay to fall away in those circumstances. No, his word indicates that anyone that does not persevere does not have saving faith. That's what his words indicate. And so we would all do well to examine ourselves and ask the question, does our trust in God fill us with confidence and equip us to put God before our own lives? Now, I guess to some extent we would probably never know that. After all, the Lord does not give us grace for times that we are not facing. So, how can we know that we will be all right in some circumstance in the future? When Jesus taught us to pray, he told us, give us this day our daily bread. In other words, we don't have to ask for things of which we have no need. He also taught us, take therefore no thought for the morrow shall take thought for the things of itself. And then he says, sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof. So it's true that we cannot know exactly how we would cope in any future given situation. And yet we can still search ourselves to ensure there is nothing fake about our faith. You know, an empty faith does not save. There's no use us hiding behind a word. Genuine, sincere faith in Jesus and what he has done, that's what saves us. And it saves us, of course, not just from, some fire of an earthly tyrant, but it saves us from the everlasting fires of hell. So again, I just emphasise as I close now that I want you not to lean on empty words, because they will soon crumble and disintegrate. Make sure that your faith is genuine, for so you will know safety and security forevermore. Amen.